My Gavanan Melanin, and well met indeed. I am Arike Galadurathan, the head of the modding team behind Divide and Conquer, a submod for Third Age Total War. But today, bringing you another lore video, and this time detailing the great enemy of Middle-earth, Melkor. Now, a few things to mention. Number one, as I say at the beginning of all of these are intended more as a sort of podcast than they are a video. So very little effort has gone into the visual aspect of this video, and I can only apologise, but it's worked up until now, and I will continue doing it that way. Number two, the images shown in this video, none of them are created by me. They are all obviously owned by whoever created them, and if anyone has any fault with my displaying an image that they recognise to be their own, please contact me, and of course the video will be edited, whatever. And lastly, to cover purely one person who I can think of who will take fault with this video, and that is Melkor is designed to be the agent of chaos in Middle-earth. He is the enemy of everything. If he had his way, all would serve him in total dominion. Not worship, not freedom, dominion. They would be enslaved. Ergo, he is bad, and we're going to portray him as bad throughout this video. I'm sorry, Big Pollet, but he is meant to be the enemy, and your contrary life needs to end. But anyway, let us begin. Melkor. To understand Melkor, we must understand first creation itself. In the very beginning of the mythos of Middle-earth, there is nothing. There is a space known only as the Void, and it covers everything. There's no universe, there's no planets, there's no stars, there's nothing. And it's the Void. Except for a single soul solitary creature, and that is Eru Ilúvatar, the One, the God of Middle-earth. And Eru Ilúvatar seeks to create, and he starts by creating the Ainur. Now the Ainur all represent certain aspects of Eru himself. For example, the Ainur who would become the Valar Yavanna represents the flora and fauna of the world. But these aspects aren't as rigid and aren't as solid yet. They're still just kind of aspects of him. So some maybe aspects of power, some of integrity, some of loyalty, some of war, things like that. But chief and greatest amongst these new creations is Melkor. Now Melkor actually is the most powerful. He is the second most powerful being in existence after Eru Ilúvatar. None of the other Valar come close to matching his power and knowledge. Manwë, who is the greatest of the Valar in time, even he cannot hope to stand alone against Melkor. And as we will see, Tulkas, the Valar of strength, he overpowers Melkor, but his knowledge and power is nowhere near as strong as Melkor. It's only in physical raw strength that he manages to take him. But so Melkor is the greatest amongst the Ainur. And at a time when the Ainur are all forming and coming together as spirits in this void, Melkor goes off alone in search of something called the Imperishable Flame. Now none of the other Ainur really know of this, and only Melkor really does. And the Imperishable Flame, as it turns out, is kind of the thing that gives life to everything. But in this time of raw darkness, Melkor seeks the only source of light to this flame. Now, he doesn't find the flame because he realizes that the flame is kind of Eru Ilúvatar. They're almost one and the same, but the flame is with Eru Ilúvatar. But in this time spent alone, Melkor comes to realize that he actually desires creation himself. He wants the same sort of powers and abilities that Eru has. So, when Eru Ilúvatar then moves on to the second stage of creation, the Aina Lindale, which is the creation of the world and the universe itself, the Ainur are all brought together and they begin singing in great harmony, in unison, save for one voice, Melkor. At this time, as I say, Melkor has already realized that he desires. That is the whole of that sentence. He, unlike the rest of the Ainur, actually craves things. My apologies, Windows getting in the way. Whereas none of the other Ainur do have this kind of sense of desire, this sense of wonderment, creation. So Melkor sings a different song to the song that Eru sends out. It's a theme. They're called themes. There are 3 of them. And Melkor's song is actually so strong and so powerful in its its counterpart to Eru, that some of the Ainur near and around him actually begin singing his song. They are tuned to his song rather than Eru's. Now some of the Ainur as well are unsure as to what's happening and they just stop singing altogether. And so this is the first signs of Melkor's discord in the creation of the world. Now Eru, seeing that Melkor is challenging him, rather than get annoyed or angry, he simply smiles, and he sends out a second theme for the Ainur to sing in an attempt to counter Melkor's song. But Melkor, seeing this, just rises to the challenge. And he then sings an even more powerful song, converting even more of the Ainur around him to sing to his song rather than to Eru's. And so he's weaving this discord and this strife through the song. And Eru, seeing that he's being challenged further, sends out a third song, a third theme. And this time he rises from his throne with a countenance of strength, and he defies Melkor, and he tries to weave Melkor's defiant song into the overall unity of the song. Now, of course, Eru Ilúvatar gives birth to everything, and even indeed at the end of the song, for once Eru realizes that Melkor is not backing down, he rises and he simply, with a great and powerful note, ends the song altogether. But he then shows the Ainur their creations, and he turns them to Ea, which is the name of everything that exists. There is the void and there is Ea. E with two little dots above it and an A. It's a very simple word. And within Ea lies the realm of Arda, which encompasses the whole of the new Earth, which we would call Earth. And then within Earth is, of course, Middle Earth, which is in the centre of the Earth. But he shows them Ea, and then he turns to Melkor and he essentially says to Melkor, I know what you were doing. I gave life and birth and creation to everything. So I am able to anticipate your discord, essentially. So he, through his attempts to counter the theme, what he actually is doing, and successfully does, is essentially weave Melkor's song into his own creation plans, and allows it to happen, allows it to pass. Now this is where a great, interesting thought can come in, and that is that essentially Eru Ilúvatar has the power initially and immediately and right away. He has the power to stop all of the potential evils of the world by simply dealing with Melkor before anything else happens. He realizes Melkor's desires. He realizes that Melkor wants to create his own things. He wants dominion. When Melkor sees Ea, he is immediately overcome with a desire to control it. When all of the Valar see, or all of the Ainur see Ea, they are immediately aware of everything that's going to happen and has ever happened within that little sphere of universe. So they're aware of the children of Ilúvatar, the elves, the humans. They know what's going to happen with their lives, and that they're all overcome with a desire to help the elves, to shape this world for the elves, because none of them knew the elves were going to be part of the song. And for reasons that the story requires, the Ainur essentially fall in love with the elves, and they want to do everything they can to help them. Save for Melkor, who looks at the elves and sees only slaves and servants and dominion and lordship. So Eru, knowing all of that, could easily stop Melkor right now. He could stop him from entering Ea, thus not having any effect on the planet and its inhabitants. But he doesn't. And that's arguably a major failing, or perhaps an argument of free will at its very, very greatest. But anyway, so some of the Ainur then enter into Ea, and they become the Valar. They're the most powerful, they're the chief, they're the greatest. They're covered in my Aina Lindale and other matters video. And they're the Valar, and chiefest amongst them, of course, is Melkor. So the Valar descend into the world, and the Maya also descend a short time afterwards. And Melkor has already begun sowing his discord once more. Many Maya already come over to Melkor. Some come over a little later on. He gets some with promises of wealth and fame and power and glory, or not fame, but... And he gathers an army behind him. These spirits. Some of them work for him in secret, remaining with the Valar, pretending to be loyal, but they work with Melkor. But bear no mistake about it, Melkor, from day one, wants to control the planet. He wants lordship over everything else. He even says that to Manwë, to his face. He says to him, I want to rule this planet, and you will all be a part of my plan. And the Valar do their best to stop him. And a war unfolds. Now, this war is really just the various Valar all countering each other. So, at this stage, the Earth is kind of like a blank canvas, and the Valar can do whatever they want. They can edit and change anything that they want. And Melkor strives to counter everything they do. So if they raise mountains, he makes them valleys. If they make valleys, he makes them mountains. If they make a sea, Melkor drains it and turns it to desert. He does everything he can to counter everything that they're doing. Basically out of spite at this point. There doesn't seem to be a reason to do this. He just seems to want what he wants, regardless of what anyone else does. Even if he doesn't care if it's a mountain, he just doesn't want them to have their way. He seems a bit like a petulant child at this point. But the war eventually gets a little bit out of hand, and finally Tulkas arrives. Now, Tulkas is the Valar of Strength, the last Valar to descend into Ea, into Arda, to take physical form, for the Valar know that when they enter the realm, their power will be bound to the world itself. So many Ainur remain in the void, where they are the most powerful beings in all known creation, save for Eru. But those that descend into Ea, their power then becomes tied to the planet itself. So in some sort of extent, they are kind of weakened. But it would mean the destruction of Ea, by any means, would drain the Valar of all their power. But anyway, Tulkas decides that he'll agree to this bargain, and he descends, and he takes his physical form. For many of the Valar, when they descend into Ea, they are forced to no longer be spectral beings and spirits wafting around doing what they will, and they tend to take physical forms. Of course, many of the Valar take on the form of the elves, and it's kind of suggested that they take on the form of the elves out of sheer... They're so enamored with the elves that they want to be as like them as possible. So they take on their human physical form, or their humanoid physical form. But Tulkas enters, and he captures Melkor. And... Well, he doesn't capture Melkor yet, sorry. Tulkas enters, and he drives Melkor away. Tulkas is so physically strong that despite the power and knowledge that Melkor has, he is afraid of Tulkas, and Tulkas forces Melkor away. And then there is a long age of peace, where the Valar are then allowed to finish their designs for Middle-earth, and it is created and finished. It becomes symmetrical completely. And at the center of this great symmetrical kind of continent is a vast lake. And within that vast lake lies the continent of Almaren, or the island of Almaren. And on the island of Almaren is where all the Valar have chosen to live. And on this island, for there's no sun or moon yet, and so the planet is still coated in darkness. But on this island they build 2 giant lamps. And these lamps give light to the whole island of Almaren and much of the world, but not all of the world. And that's important to note. For the light only goes so far, and in the dark reaches beyond what's called the Wall of Night, Melkor is residing. And he gathers to him vast forces, the Maiar that have joined with him, the spirits that have fallen to his will. And eventually the Valar come to have a great feast, for their work is finished. They've built this planet, they've built this world. And at this feast, Tulkas and, I believe it's Nessa, get married. And in an interesting little twist, Tulkas drinks and is so merry he falls asleep. And Melkor, seeing that Tulkas' greatest enemy is asleep, he sneaks over the Wall of Night and takes up residence in the far north, where he builds a Tumno. And a Tumno is kind of like a sort of link to the underworld before the Halls of Mandos, but not really. It's just a vast fortress/dungeon complex in the far north. And he's able to build this because Tulkas sleeps apparently for years, and so there's no one to watch over Melkor. But Melkor, when he takes up place in a Tumno, his corruption begins to spread. And this is the first sign that the Valar get that Melkor has returned properly. Animals begin attacking and killing each other. There's disease spreading throughout the land. A fierce winter grips the northern parts of the world. For, of course, there's no sun. There's no planetary rotational axis, so there's no seasons or anything. Winter is a construct of Melkor. It's not born out of the way that the world turns or the way it rotates around a physical object. It is entirely a creation by the gods of this world. And Melkor is kind of the embodiment of winter, the death that winter brings, and the chill and the cold. And so his corruption spreads from the north, so the Valar become aware that he is there. But before they can do anything about it, Melkor attacks. And Melkor completely overthrows the Valar in his onslaught. It's so vicious, and the 2 lamps, Iluin and Ormal, are destroyed. Melkor brings them down, thus plunging the world back into darkness. But not only does he destroy the lamps, he also destroys the island of Almaren itself, and the symmetry of the world is said to be destroyed at this point. Melkor's attack is so great that he changes the very planet, the very world itself. Now the Valar can counter Melkor. They are stronger than him when there is all of them combined together. But Melkor's attack is so ferocious that if they can't do anything but try to stop the world falling into ruin, so they are unable to chase him away. And eventually they concede defeat and they pull away to their new land of Aman. Now Aman is also called Valinor. This is where the elves go at the end of their lives when they sail away, and also if they just die they go to Valinor. So it's a win-win for elves really. But Valinor or Aman becomes the resting place of the Valar, the home of the Valar, far to the west. Now here, like the two lamps, Iluin and Ormal, they construct or they grow two great trees to give light to the earth. And these are called Telperion and Laurelin, and there they are in the centre of the screen. Now these trees again send out light much in the same way that a sun and a moon would, and they cover the land in light. So Melkor, having beaten them once, now is again very angry, for they have again brought light to the world, the thing that he strives to remove, and they have set up somewhere else. But seeing that Melkor has a little bit of an advantage here, he takes this time to construct the fortress of Angband, the Iron Prison, in the Ered Engrin, the Iron Mountains. And here comes into our tale the enemy that many of you will of course have heard of, Sauron the Deceiver, for Angband becomes the charge of Sauron and he takes up residence there and controls it, as already Sauron is Melkor's greatest lieutenant. Now, to just touch about Sauron, Sauron was originally a Maya of the people of Aule, so he is a smith, essentially. He's a builder, he's a creator, he's a miner, he's all things construction. But he is brought over to Melkor and then, of course, becomes Melkor's greatest servant in time. So Sauron takes up residence in Angband, but the Valar then, seeing they've restored this sort of peace, you could say, to the world, but also they've stopped this ruinous tide that was growing from Melkor's attack, and they've brought balance to the planet once again. So then they decide that they're going to attack Melkor again before he gets too strong, but in their first attack they lose, and they are beaten back, and they retreat to Aman. And then some time passes, and the key event of Middle-earth takes place, the Eruchini, the awakening of the elves at Cuivianen, and the elves become to being. Thus, the first age, I believe, takes place at the awakening of the first elves. But these elves are found by Melkor before they are found by Arome, the wandering huntsman of the Valar, and Melkor captures and ensnares a great many elves, and this is where the first orc creation myth comes from, that many of the elves may then have been twisted and warped and turned to orcs, where they then begin breeding as orcs rather than elves. But then Arome does find the elves and he begins leading them back to Aman. But before the elves can get back to Aman and on their great journey, there is a sound of great strife and war and far off in the distance, and the elves are absolutely unsure as to what it is. But of course, for the rest of us, we know that this is because, seeing that the elves have now awoken and that Melkor is directly threatening their existence, the Valar attack him once again. And this time they attack in such force and such strength that they just totally destroy Autumno, leaving only Angband and Sauron to survive, and they capture Melkor. He is chained with something called the Chain of Angainor, and Tulkas chains him himself, and they drag him back to Aman, and they imprison him in the Halls of Mandos, which is the place where the dead elves, their spirits, go before they are judged and deemed whether they can return to Aman to live forever on this blessed island, or whether they will remain in the Hall of Mandos. So Melkor is sent back there, and he resides there for a great amount of time, like thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But in this time that passes, he eventually then sucks up his desire for vengeance against the Valar and his desire for dominion, and he goes to Manwë and he begs to be pardoned. He begs to be released. And Manwë, for stupid reasons, basically, for reasons no one really knows why, Manwë agrees. And he says, you can't leave the island of Aman, but I'll let you out of the Hall of Mandos. And both Tulkas and Ulmo tell Manwë that this is a silly idea. But he does it regardless. So Melkor is now allowed to wander freely around the world, and he quickly comes into contact with the three elven clans who have made it to Aman, the Vanya, the Teleri, and the Noldor. Now the Vanya immediately distrust Melkor. They won't even have an audience with him, they reject him. the Teleri, Melkor decides, are far beneath him and that they would never be able to help him in his grand schemes. However, the Noldor, who greatest amongst the elves, desire knowledge. They want to know everything. They want to be able to create and do everything. And their desires line up very much with Melkor's. And he sees that maybe he might be able to coerce them into supporting him. So he comes to the chief and greatest of the Noldor, Fëanor. And there, Fëanor is, in a very interesting fantasy way, constructing the 3 Silmaril, which are the topic of the Silmarillion. And Fëanor creates these great gems, but Melkor comes to Fëanor, and he tries to get him to see that the Valar are kind of working against him, that they're not his ally, they are in fact his enemy. But really, Melkor... Well, not really, but Melkor sees these Silmaril and immediately desires them above all else. They totally ensnare him, and he wants them more than anything. So he comes to Fëanor to try and get Fëanor to side with him, to make an alliance between the Noldor High Kings, or the Noldor High King, and Melkor himself. However, Fëanor, seeing that Melkor's true desire is to own these Silmaril for himself, he casts Melkor out and he banishes him away. He has nothing to do with him. So Melkor flees to the south of the island, where he bumps into, rather by chance, Ungoliant. Now, Ungoliant is the mother of all spiders, and she is a Maiar spirit who has taken the form of a giant spider. And she used to serve Melkor until he was captured by the Valar when the elves were making their great journey. But Melkor quickly gets her to join back with him and side back with the darkness. And so, now that Melkor knows exactly what he wants to do, he wants these Silmaril for himself. They must be his, and he wants to enact vengeance on the Valar for their basically beating him. And he knows that the Valar's greatest and chief love is this light that they've managed to set up around the world. And so with Ungoliant he hatches a plan, and together Ungoliant creates a web of shadow over both of them. So she creates a kind of invisibility barrier over both of them, and they manage to make it to the trees, where Melkor then drains the trees of their life, and Ungoliant swallows their very existence, their lifeblood, their sap. And so they drown Aman in darkness once more. The whole world again plunges into darkness, thanks to Ungoliant and Melkor. But they aren't finished there. Oh no. Together they then make their way north to the city of Formenos, which is kind of the capital of the Noldorine realm in Aman. And they not only do they get almost all the jewels that the Noldor have created, but they of course take the Silmaril. But they also kill Finwë, the current High King of the Noldor. Thus meaning that Fëanor, I believe, becomes the High King. I should have checked that one. But they kill the High King of the Noldor, they steal all their jewels, they steal the Silmaril, they drown Aman in darkness, and they flee over something called the Helcarax, which is a great ice bridge that connects Aman to Middle-earth. And they flee back to their fortress of Angband. But here disaster strikes. For Melkor allows Ungoliant, for all she wants is to devour everything. She wants this darkness to cover everything, and the best place for this darkness is within her. So she desires to eat all the jewels that they took from the Noldor. And Melkor allows this, but he doesn't let her devour the 3 Silmaril. But Melkor, being quite weakened now from the power it required to siege, to assault Formenos, to kill the king, to steal the jewels, to flee the Helcarax, he is quite weak, and Ungoliant isn't, and she overpowers him, and she comes very, very close to killing Melkor. But in his screams of agony and terror, the Balrogs, his most faithful and loyal servants, led by Goth-Mog, they find him and they drive Ungoliant off, and her part in the tale comes to an end. So he then takes up residence in Beleriand, and this is where then the First Age really and truly takes shape. For this is Beleriand, and hopefully you can see my cursor. To the very, very north, way above Anfauglith, is Angband, up here in the arid Angrin, just off the map. And that is where Melkor takes up residence with his now 3 Silmaril. But whilst he's in Beleriand, he then learns that in all the time he spent in captivity, and then all the plans he had in Aman, he comes to learn that actually the elves have taken over Beleriand, and it's very much owned by them. In the hidden kingdom of Doriath here in the centre, Elu Thingol and Melian the Maya lead the Sindar, and a great nation in the forest here. We also learn that Círdan the Shipwright controls many elves and many lands over here in the Falas, the coastal region of western Beleriand. And finally, the Green Elves of Assyriand, led by Denethor, their king, reside here in the 7 rivers of Assyriand. And he learns, therefore, that the whole of the land is basically owned by the elves. Now, of course, Melkor hates the Valar, but he also, with a burning passion, hates the elves. He absolutely wants the elves to be his slaves. He can't abide them having free lands and ownership of anything. He wants them to purely be his, and nothing more. Almost like a giant middle finger to Eru Ilúvatar, who created these beings unbeknownst to all the other Ainur. Melkor wants to control all of them to show his essentially father that he's more powerful than Eru ever imagined. So he immediately sets out to attack the elves. After a while, of course. But Angband, remember, didn't actually fall. Sauron escaped, the Balrogs all escaped, many orcs breeding for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. He's got a vast army, and he attacks the elves in the first battle of Beleriand. There are 5 battles of Beleriand, and each has an interesting name, save for the first one, which is just called the First Battle. So, what Melkor does is he issues forth out of Angband and he surrounds Doriath in a hope to cut it off from Círdan of the Falas. However, Eleuthingol manages to get a message to Denethor of Assyriand, and the Green Elves come together with the forces of Doriath and they rout the orcs from Angband. It's a very, very strong victory for the elves, but it gets even worse for the orcs, for as they are then fleeing north between the rivers Gelion and rivers Aros, they then are met by a horde of dwarves coming down out of the Blue Mountains and Mount Dolmed. The dwarves issue forth, or the Norgrim, which is the Sindarin name for dwarves, they issue forth out of the Blue Mountains, and Melkor's army is utterly destroyed, and he returns to Angband with his tail between his legs. But much of the history of Beleriand concerning Melkor is just these battles, so we move on to number 2. I, of course, am not giving dates for these because much of the First Age happens in weird time periods, the time of the trees, the time of the sun, and it's all very strange. But the next battle that Melkor... Because, as I say, Melkor only actually takes part in Beleriand in these battles. He doesn't really wander around doing other things. There's no sort of Sauron element where, obviously, Sauron flees and becomes the Necromancer of Dol Guldur. He flees to the east and rallies the Men of Rune and the Easterlings. And he's here, there, and everywhere. Melkor only really gets involved in these battles. And, spoiler alert, he loses 3 of them. So the second battle of Beleriand is called the Dagor Nuin Gileath, which means the battle under the stars. And this battle is marked by the arrival of Fëanor. Now, Fëanor's story would be covered another time, of course. There's the kinslaying of Alqualonde, and of course the curse of the sons of Fëanor. But we'll worry about that all in a much later video if we cover Beleriand's history. But for Melkor's concerned, Fëanor arrives with the Noldor, sworn to return the Silmaril to his charge. He is absolutely hell-bent on getting the Silmaril back. And he besieges Melkor. He attacks Melkor. Now, Melkor issues out to attack Fëanor and his Noldorine army, but the elves of Aman are far greater and more powerful than any other elves in existence, and the orcs have never fought against elves from Valinor yet, and seeing it's described as a spirit or a fire in the eyes of the elves, the orcs flee before them. They break. They don't even give fight. They don't even fight back. They just run away. And so the elves charge them down, cutting them down, killing them where they can. But Fëanor overstretches his hand, and he charges down the gates of Angband with a small retinue. Now the orcs, seeing that their numbers are now massively on their side, they turn back and they cut Fëanor off from the rest of his army. And at this point, the Balrogs of Morgoth issue forth from the halls, and Fëanor is locked in battle with the Balrogs, and he takes many, many wounds until eventually he is slain by Gothmog, the leader of the Balrogs, chief and greatest of the servants that isn't Sauron of Melkor. It's also worth mentioning just at this moment, as we're talking about Fëanor, that Melkor's other name is Morgoth. Now, Melkor is his Valian name, or his Valar name, but Morgoth is his Sindarin name, and it's given to him by Fëanor, and it just means the black enemy. Because Melkor doesn't necessarily mean like enemy or foe, But Morgoth means black enemy, and Fëanor gives him that name when Melkor steals the Silmaril. And ever after, no elf ever refers to him as Melkor, for they see that as doing him a service, and they don't want anything to do with him, so they call him their own name, which just means the black enemy. So Fëanor is killed outside the gates of Angband, but the army of Melkor is routed or destroyed as well. And again, a long time of peace comes. Until we come to the third battle, the Dagor Aglarab, which just means glorious battle, or Dagor Aglareb, sorry. And this is the arrival of Fingolfin. Now, Fingolfin is also of the Noldor, but he didn't take the ships from Alqualonde. He didn't kill the Teleri to get to Middle-earth. He crosses the Helcarax, the ice bridge. And interestingly, amongst his number is Galadriel, Lady of Light, who will of course come to reside in Lothlorien. But Fingolfin arrives with more Noldorin, with even more of the Noldor, and a third battle takes place, the Glorious Battle. And it's called that simply because it's an absolutely crushing victory for the elves. Melkor's force is once again utterly destroyed, and there's an image showing the troop movements. So Fingolfin arrives from the Helcarax, and he comes down from the north, and he meets up with the march of Maerthros. Now, Maerthros is the oldest son of Fëanor. So, of course, he wants vengeance for his father's death, and together their armies combine, and they utterly destroy Melkor's army, and they even lay siege to Angband, the Iron Prison. Thus, it chiefly takes up its name. And then a vast time of peace occurs. We have a long, long time of peace where there is no evil in the world save for in that tiny, small section of Angband. But unbeknownst to the forces of good, Angband isn't just a fortress above the mountains and under the three peaks of Thangorodrim. It is a vast underground city. Doesn't even do it justice. It's like a country underground. It's huge. And Melkor spends this time because the enemy can't break into Angband. This fortress is just too strong. The fortress itself, it's essentially like trying to siege Mount Everest. It just can't be done. You can stand outside it all you want, but you're never going to bring the thing down. And this is the problem the elves have. So they resign themselves to just sieging this mountain range fortress. But in time, Melkor regains his strength. Now, another of Melkor's servants are two dragons in their time, and the one that is most useful to him at this point is Glaurung the dragon. Now, the dragons, again, I'd cover in different videos if we come onto them, but Glaurung is one of Melkor's greatest servants, and in the next battle, the Dagor Bragalak, Glaurung really makes himself known. Now, the Dagor Bragalak means the Battle of Sudden Flame, and it is just that. Melkor, seizing his time to return to Middle-earth in power, uses every ounce of his strength to quite literally issue forth flames and fire across the field in front of Angband. Anfauglith is the name of the fields. And it's so powerful that he is said to have set hordes of elven horsemen on fire, and that's where I've chosen this image from. But with this great flame, and then all the Balrogs surge forth, Glaurung surges forth. He's not the only dragon, there are other dragons in service of Melkor. The whole host of Melkor issues out of the fortress of Angband, and they totally rout the defenders of the siege line. And it is an absolutely horrific loss for the elves. They're caught completely unawares, and they are totally destroyed. Melkor then manages to claim dominion over almost all of northern Beleriand. Everything north of Doriath, the mountains stretching from the sea across to the blue, is Melkor's domain. But a challenger arises in this time of great strife, Fingolfin. He who arrived earlier with the army of the Noldor across the Helcarax comes to challenge Melkor in single combat. And Melkor has the greatest curse that the powerful always have, and that is the fear of death. Unlike any of the other Valar, and indeed any of the Ainur, Melkor fears death more than anything else, because death would of course mean that none of his plans can come to fruition, and Eru would get the last laugh. And so Melkor is actually quite reticent to meet the challenge of Fingolfin, because he's terrified that this man might actually kill him. And he has no idea what happens if his life is taken. No Valar has yet been killed. None have been mortally wounded. No one really knows what happens when they die. Although there's a suggestion that some of the Valar, some nameless Valar we don't know of, are killed in the various wars Melkor has with them. But no one really knows what happens to them when they die, and Melkor is terrified of death, but he can't not meet the challenge of a lowly elf. So he meets Fingolfin's challenge, and battle is joined. Now Fingolfin actually gets 7 hits in on Melkor. He wounds him 7 times, but he realizes that killing a Valar is way beyond the power of a mortal elf, or an immortal elf, or just any being that isn't as powerful as a Valar, an Ainur, or a Maiar. And Fingolfin realizes that he's going to lose, but he fights regardless, and 3 times he is knocked to the ground, and each time he stands back up and fights again, until eventually he is overcome, and Melkor crushes him. Now, Melkor's weapon at this point, just to tie in with the later story that many of you will know, is called Grond, the Hammer of the Underworld, and Grond then lends its name in the Third Age to the great wolf's head siege ram that Sauron uses to break open the gates of Minas Tirith. But with Grond, Melkor beats Fingolfin down and then comes to stand on him to crush Fingolfin to death. And at this point, Fingolfin gets one last stab in on Melkor, and it's said that the caverns, the great holes in the ground that Grond has wrought with his aggressive power, they are then filled with the blood of Melkor. And Melkor does kill Fingolfin. But before he can just destroy and ruin his body, Thorondor, the chief and greatest eagle under the power of Manwë, flies in, scratches Melkor, pushes him away, and flees with the body of Fingolfin, so that his body can at least be laid to rest with respect. Now, there's a brief little interlude here before the story truly continues, and we'll just cover it very briefly, and that is that Beren and Luthien, the famed lovers of the First Age, who Aragorn and Arwen are very much modelled on, they managed to actually steal a Silmaril from Melkor at this time. And they do it by sneaking into Angband under disguise. And then Melkor does know what's happening. He knows they're there, but he allows them to come before him. And Luthien actually puts him to sleep with her mystical music and dancing. And at that time, they then steal a Silmaril and then bugger off. So he actually loses a Silmaril at this point to Beren and Luthien, which is quite an interesting one. But they are soon to get their own book coming out this year, where you'll be able to read an awful lot more about that side of the story. Or indeed, we'll cover them in a separate video. But so, without any fighting at all, where Melkor's concerned, he manages to now lose one of the Silmaril that he's held since he stole them right back at the beginning. But then comes the great battle that many people will probably know of in Beleriand, and it's called the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. It's quite a mouthful. I probably should have put it on the screen, I'm sorry. But it does mean the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. And this is an absolute catastrophe. By the time of the 5th battle, humans have made their way to Beleriand, and they reside in and around in various places. And the Nirnaeth Arnoediad is an attempt to fully remove Melkor. They're like, for once and for all, we're going to crush him, we're going to siege his fortress, we're going to banish him. But, unbeknownst to the forces of good, Melkor is totally aware that they are planning an attack. And this attack comes from everything. Dwarves, humans, elves, all together. The whole lands of Beleriand are essentially emptied to fight this battle. And Melkor completely sees it coming, and he is able to totally cut it off. And using support from the Easterlings from Middle-earth, for at this time Easterlings just applies to everybody who lives east of the Blue Mountains. But using evil men from Middle-earth who have joined with Melkor, he manages to use them in surprise to flank the vast host that is now before Angband. And it's an absolutely destructive loss for the forces of good. They are obliterated. But special mention is to be had of the Norgrim, the dwarves, and their king at this time, whose name I've totally forgotten. I apologise, it'll probably come to me in a moment. But in this great destruction and all this loss and death, the dwarves manage to get close to Glaurung the dragon, pictured in the centre there, and they actually damage his underside. They actually do damage to Glaurung, and they force him to flee. But their king is slain in this attack, and the dwarves, it is said, are so feared by the orcs that then the orcs essentially stop fighting them, And they allow the dwarves to go and pick up their king and then solemnly march off the battlefield in a funeral parade. And the orcs just leave them alone. They just let them do it. They're so afraid of the dwarves. But of course, the ultimate loss here is with the elves. And now Melkor has even more control. The only lands really that now resist him is Gondolin, the hidden city. And that is about it, for his hand reaches out way through Beleriand now. Doriath is attacked, Falas is attacked. The elves are forced to retreat to the Isle of Valar, which, if you look up on a map of Beleriand, is way down to the far, far south. And essentially, almost all of Beleriand falls power to Melkor. And then the last bastion of hope for the elves, the hidden city of Gondolin, also falls. It is just a domino effect. But Gondolin is just that. It's a hidden city. No one actually knows where it is. No one's able to get to it. And it's protected by the eagles and by the power of the elves. But it's betrayed. It is sold out by a traitor elf called Merglin. And Merglin sells out the city, and Melkor comes on it in incredible force. And he destroys Gondolin. But this starts off a chain reaction that turns events very much the other way. For within Gondolin reside two people, Tuor and Idril, a human and an elf, who have found union together and have borne the child Eärendil, who will become to be known as the Mariner. But at this time, Tuor and Idril escape Gondolin under the protection of the mighty Glorfindel and, of course, Ecthelion of the Fountain. And although Gondolin is destroyed, Gothmog, the chief of the Balrogs, is also killed by Ecthelion in the courtyard of the fountain in the city of Gondolin. Ecthelion is killing Gothmog, but both of them do die. So Melkor loses his greatest servant now, save for Sauron. But Gondolin is destroyed, the last bastion of elven resistance falls, and Melkor now essentially controls all of Beleriand, and therefore, kind of by extension, all of Middle-earth. But Eärendil, who escaped with his parents Tuor and Idril, he sails to Aman. This is virtually unheard of. Humans aren't allowed on Aman, and only elves are. But Eärendil is half and half, and this kind of works in his favour. But he lands in Aman, and he beseeches the Valar, and he says to them, look, Melkor has won. The whole of Middle-earth is enslaved. Every bastion of peace and freedom and hope that we had left is gone. We cannot do anything without you. If you do not come back, the elves will be his servants forever. And the Valar heed this call, and together with a vast host that likely includes the Vanyar and the Teleri, the Valar return to Beleriand, and they fight back. And then comes the final war of Beleriand, which isn't counted in the 5 wars, and that is the War of Wrath. And it's at this time, actually, that Eärendil kills Glaurung the dragon from his boat, the Vingilot. Or Vigilot, can't remember which one it was. But the War of Wrath takes place. Melkor is utterly destroyed. The elves and the forces of the Valar, the host of the Valar as they are known, they destroy everything. And in an effort to ensure that everything Melkor ever touched is destroyed, the entire continent of Beleriand, or the entire, peninsula maybe a better word, is sunk beneath the sea. All of Beleriand is destroyed. Many elves escape east, of course. Many of them go with Orofer, the father of Thranduil, and they set up in Mirkwood. Many of the green elves of Assyrian escape and then set up places like Lothlorien and Mirkwood. Obviously, the Sindar become the kings of the Sylvan, who already live in Mirkwood and Lothlorien. But many of them escape. The humans that fought with the Valar are given Numenor as their prize. Their loyalty is rewarded, and they are raised up above other humans. They're given long life, they're given power, knowledge, and they're given this little island purely for themselves. But Melkor is once again captured. And he, this time, is banished back to the Void. He is banished outside the walls of Ea completely. So he's returned essentially back to where the Ainur are, in chains, enslaved. One would imagine that the Ainur then look over Melkor and ensure he can't do any evil. But the Valar use all their power to banish him back to the Void from whence he came. And the chief enemy of Middle-earth is gone. He is no more. But there's a prophecy called the Second Prophecy of Mandos. And it says, much like every good religion has a world-ending cataclysm, Ragnarok, whatever it's called in the Bible, is it Armageddon or something? I can't even remember. When all the people go to heaven and everyone else stays down. I can't remember what it's called. But anyway, there's one of those in Middle-earth as well, and it's called the Dagor Daggorath, and it means the battle of all battles. And it's said that at a time in the future, unbeknownst to anyone, Melkor will break free of his bonds and he will return to Ea, whereupon an utter destruction will face the world. Melkor will be slain by Turin Turambar, who is imaged in front of you, everyone's favourite profile picture on Lord of the Rings sites. There's Turin Turambar, and it's said that he will kill Melkor, but not before Melkor destroys almost everything. And this is essentially the end of the world. Although it is then also said that with the final destruction of evil in the world, with Melkor's complete destruction, the world is then kind of born anew and flourishes with no threat from any of these godlike beings. So, Melkor is gone, but evil is not yet gone, because of course one great power survived and lives on in Melkor's name, and whilst he initially succumbs to the power of the Valar and promises to do good and fight with them, he eventually turns his back on the Valar, just as they turn their back on Middle-earth completely. The Valar remove Aman from the world at this time. Oh no, that's at the end of the next one, sorry. So they stay for a little while, but one of Melkor's servants does survive and leads the charge in his name, and that is of course Sauron and the Deceiver. But that is the story of Melkor. It's a bit of an interesting one because whilst he's the chief enemy, much of what he's done is covered in broad sweeping strokes. So like 1,000 years of history is covered in a single sentence in the books, and it's quite difficult to piece together anything really that we know about him, anything extra. So really it's just a kind of chronology of the First Age, because the First Age events only really take place because Melkor is there. If he weren't there, it'd be a much more different setting. A much different setting, of course. But then much of everything would be different if Melkor wasn't there, so. But I do hope that you've enjoyed listening to me ramble about Melkor, and I don't know what one will be next. It'll likely be another month away. As I say, these are about a month in between. But if you have liked what you've seen, then by all means pop a comment down below and let me know. But until we speak again, dear friends, Nevarna den Pedimad Melunin, and farewell.